The boot came down on her shoulder like it planned to stay. She hit the floor hard enough to taste copper and old sawdust together. The room laughed, loud and long. 20 men who had decided this was not their trouble. A coin spun on the boards beside her hand, bright and mocking. From the far corner where the lamplight failed, a stool scraped slow across the wood. One scrape. The laughter thinned. Outside the saloon doors, the valley stretched wide and quiet under the summer moon, holding secrets in its dry grass and its fenced ridges and its old graves. Inside, the scarred man set his glass down without finishing it. He walked forward without hurry, without anger, the way a mountain moves when it has finally decided to answer. The woman on the floor did not cry. She planted one scraped palm, then the other, and she pushed herself up. The scarred man was 4 steps away. She did not cry. That was the first thing. Later, people would talk about what happened in Coldwater Saloon on the evening of July 14, 1886. They would talk about the scarred man in the corner, the counting, the silence after. They would talk about it for years. In the particular way, small towns talk about things that crack the order they had pretended was permanent. But nobody talked about the fact that Naomi Hartwell did not cry. Not once. Not even when her cheek hit the floorboards, hard enough to taste copper and sawdust at the same time. Not when the laughter started. Not when somebody threw a coin and it spun on the wood next to her fingers, bright and spinning and mocking, like a little joke the whole room was in on except her. She did not cry. She pressed one scraped palm against the floor, then the other, and she pushed herself up to her knees. Stay down, ranch girl. The boot caught her shoulder before she made it all the way up. She went sideways again, hard. The room laughed harder. 20 men in that saloon, 20 grown men, drovers and gamblers, and one man who went to church every single Sunday and sat in the third pew from the front and shook hands with the preacher at the door. 20 men, not one of them moved. It had started the way most disasters start. Quietly, with something small. Naomi had come into Redstone that afternoon, carrying her mother's brooch in her coat pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief. The handkerchief still smelled like Eleanor Hartwell's cedar chest, which was the kind of detail that could undo a person if they let it. Naomi did not let it. She had a list, supplies at Garvey's general store. A word with the man at the land office about the fence survey Jonas had filed before he took sick. And one last thing. The hardest thing. The thing she'd been putting off for 6 weeks. Sell the brooch. Turquoise, set in silver. Her mother had worn it to church every Sunday for 20 years. Naomi had not been able to look at it since the funeral. But the trough in the north pasture needed repair. The roof above the kitchen had a soft spot that would not survive another winter, and Ethan Cole, who was 19 years old and had worked the ridge since he was 12, deserved a wage this month, which meant Naomi needed cash she did not have. So the brooch, she'd heard a man named Cutter Foss was buying silver at Coldwater's on Tuesday evenings. She didn't like the sound of that arrangement, walking into a saloon alone to sell a piece of her mother's jewelry to a man she'd never met. But she liked the sound of a caved-in roof even less. She went in. Foss wasn't there, but Jack Vance was. Jack Vance worked for Gideon Marsh. Everybody in the valley knew that. The same way everybody knew not to say it too loud and not to say it at all if Marsh himself was in the room. Marsh was not in the room that evening. Vance was playing cards at the big table near the window. 4 other men with him, and Vance was cheating. Naomi could see it from across the room. The way his left elbow shifted, the slight drop of the wrist when he dealt. She'd grown up watching her father play honest cards with honest men, and she knew the difference. She should have walked out. She knew that. Even then, standing at the edge of the room with her mother's brooch in her pocket and sawdust on her boots, she knew the smart thing was to turn around. Leave. Come back on a day when Cutter Foss was actually there. Except, one of the men at that table was Ned Briggs, 22 years old, son of Amos Briggs. who'd worked the land next to Hartwell Ridge for 30 years and never once asked for anything he hadn't earned. Ned was watching Vance deal, and his face had the particular look of a young man who knows he's being cheated and has calculated, correctly, that he cannot say so. Naomi walked across the room. She stood at the edge of the table. "That man took a queen from the bottom of the deck," she said. "Slid it up his sleeve." Everybody at this table saw him do it. The room went quiet, not peaceful quiet, the other kind. The kind that happens right before something breaks. Vance looked up at her. He smiled the way a man smiles when he is very sure of himself in a room full of people who are sure of him too. "Miss Carter," he said. Except that wasn't her name, and he knew it. "A small thing, a deliberate small thing, Hartwell," she said. "My name is Naomi Hartwell. Miss Hartwell." He said it like it tasted funny. "Why don't you go on back to whatever ranch you crawled out of and let the grown men finish their game?" "I'll go," she said. "Right after you put the queen back." He hit her before she finished the sentence. The floor was sticky. It smelled like spilled whiskey and boot leather, and years of men standing on it and not thinking about who might fall on it someday. Naomi lay still for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to know all her teeth were still in her head. Long enough to hear the laughter starting up around her, climbing out of the walls and the floorboards and the low smoke-stained ceiling. She pressed her palm to the floor. She pushed, "Stay down, ranch girl." The boot came down on her shoulder. She went sideways again. Her cheek hit the boards. Something warm and copper-tasting filled the left side of her mouth. She did not cry. But she did look up, past the boot, past Vance's smile, past the ring of laughing faces, toward the long bar at the back of the room where Holt Holloway, who had run this saloon for 11 years, and whose wife had once borrowed Eleanor Hartwell's good shawl for a winter funeral, and returned it, pressed and folded, was wiping the inside of a glass with a cloth and looking somewhere that was not here. "Mr. Holloway," she said. He did not look up. "Mr. Holloway, there is a man with his boot on a woman in your establishment." "Miss Hartwell," Holloway said, still not looking. "This establishment does not take sides in matters at the card tables." "This is not a card table matter." "Then I don't know what kind of matter it is." "It is the kind of matter," she said, her voice flat and steady, in a way that cost her something, "where a man has his boot on a woman in a public house in front of 20 witnesses." Holloway's cloth stopped moving and sent inside the glass. He looked up. His eyes were polite as a Sunday deacon. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "this establishment does not take sides in that either." Someone in the crowd whooped. Someone else tossed a coin. It hit the floor an inch from her fingers. Spun bright and slow. "Pick it up, ranch girl. Go on, pick it up." Naomi closed her fingers into a fist. Her own nails drew blood from her palm. She would not pick it up. She would lie on that floor until next winter. Before she closed her hand around a coin one of these men had thrown at her, she turned her head. Slow. Past the laughing faces. Sheriff Harlow Pruitt was leaning against the far end of the bar with a glass in his hand, and his badge turned just slightly, just enough, so the lamplight didn't catch it square. He did not move when she found his face. "Sheriff Pruitt," she said. "He took a drink, Sheriff. I am a woman on the ground in a public house. There are 20 men standing over me. One of them has his boot on my shoulder. I am asking you, as a sworn officer of the law in Redstone, to do what you took an oath to do." Pruitt set his glass down with a small, careful sound. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Maybe this isn't the time. It is exactly the time." He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he does not want to be responsible for. "You shouldn't have come in here alone." There it was. She heard it. The whole room heard it. The sheriff of Redstone had just looked at a woman on the floor, in front of every drover and gambler and card cheat in the county, and told her she had earned this by walking through a door. Naomi laughed. It wasn't a pretty sound. It came out short and hard, and she couldn't have stopped it if she'd tried. And it shocked the room more than the accusation had, because it was not the laugh of a woman who found anything funny. It was the laugh of a woman who had just had something confirmed that she had not wanted confirmed. "I came in here," she said, "to sell my mother's brooch to a man in a public house in the middle of the afternoon. And you are telling me, Harlow Pruitt, that I should not have come in, Naomi." "You do not get to call me Naomi," she said. "Not with his boot on me and your badge turned sideways. You do not get to call me anything." A man at the card table whistled low. Vance ground his heel down into her shoulder until she gasped. She couldn't stop the gasp. She hated herself for it. "She's got nothing," Vance said. "Dead father. Dying herd. Mouth that doesn't know when to quit." He pressed down harder. "Say please, Miss Hartwell. Get off me. Say please. I will see you answer for this before I say please to you." Vance's smile changed, thinned. The smile of a man who has just understood that the woman under his boot is not afraid of him in the way he expected her to be. The way he needed her to be. "Boys," he said. "Hold her down. I'm going to teach this ranch girl some manners." Two more men stepped forward, and that was when the room changed. Not loudly, not all at once. Not in any way the men stepping forward noticed, but in the far corner of the room, the darkest corner, the one nearest the cold end of the bar, where the light from the oil lamps didn't quite reach, a stool scraped against the floorboards. Quiet, just one scrape. Naomi heard it. She turned her head, her cheeks still flat against the sticky floor. And she found him. He was taller than he'd looked sitting down. His coat was old, the kind of deep brown that starts as something darker and gets worn by years of weather into the color of creek mud after a long rain. Bare skin, she would realize later, lined with it at least. The kind of coat a man makes himself when he's been somewhere cold enough and long enough that the trading posts start to feel like rumors. A scar ran from his left ear down along the jaw and disappeared into the collar of his shirt. Silvered, old, healed so long ago it had stopped being a wound and become just a part of his face. The way ridges become a part of a mountain. Gray at his temples. Lines around his eyes, not from laughing. From looking at distances. He was not young. He was not the kind of handsome that the boys in town were handsome. He had the kind of face that had been reduced by years and weather and something harder to name down to its essential parts. What was left was simple, honest, without any ornamentation whatsoever. He set his glass on the bar. He did not finish it. He walked toward the center of the room. He did not hurry, did not square his shoulders, did not put his hand anywhere near the pistol at his hip. He walked the way a man walks across his own barn in the dark, sure of the floor, sure of his right to be on it. The laughter thinned. One by one, the men at the card table stopped laughing and turned around. Vance was the last. Still had his boot on Naomi's shoulder when he felt the room go quiet behind him. He looked up. The scarred man was 4 steps away. "Step off her," he said. Not loud, not angry, just said. The way you say a thing you mean completely, and have no interest in debating. Vance smiled, the wrong smile. The smile of a man who has not yet understood what he is looking at. "Mister," he said. "You don't know who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," the scarred man said. "I'm talking to a man with his boot on a woman. Step off. I work for Gideon Marsh. You work for whoever you want. Step off the woman." Vance's jaw tightened. "You got one chance to walk back to your corner." The scarred man said nothing. He waited. "The way mountains wait." 3, he said. Vance didn't move. 2. A muscle jumped in Vance's jaw. Something shifted behind his eyes. He looked left, looked right. At the men around him. At the room. At the sheriff who was studying his whiskey glass very carefully and not looking back. 1. Vance's boot came off her shoulder. He stepped back, slowly, like it was his idea. The room stayed quiet. Naomi did not look at Vance when he moved. She did not look at the scarred man either, though every nerve in her body had pulled tight in his direction from the moment she'd heard that stool scrape. She planted one hand, then the other, and she pushed herself up. First to her knees, then, shaking, to her feet. She did it herself. No one offered a hand. And if someone had, she would not have taken it. Not in that room. Not with all of them watching. Standing, she was shorter than she'd felt on the floor. The top of her head came to the scarred man's collarbone. She did not look at him. She looked past him, at Vance, at Holloway, at Pruitt, who was still examining his glass. "Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice shook only at the very end of the last syllable, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. "You will remember this night for the rest of your life. I intend to make sure of that." She let it sit a moment. "And Mr. Holloway, and Sheriff Pruitt, and every man in this room who laughed, you will remember it. Because I have a long memory, and my father taught me to write things down, somewhere at the back of the room." Near the door, an old drover with white in his beard said quietly, "Amen, miss." One voice, just one, small as a stone dropped in still water. Naomi heard it. She did not show that she heard it. But something in her chest that had been bleeding quietly since she hit the floor finally, for one moment, stopped. She turned toward the door. She did not look at the scarred man. She did not thank him. She walked the full length of that saloon. Past Holloway, who would not meet her eye. Past Pruitt, who cleared his throat as if he had something to say and then decided he didn't. Past the card table, where one of the younger men, a boy really not more than 20, tipped his hat as she passed. Tipped it like she was a woman coming out of a Sunday service. And he couldn't look at her either. At the door, she stopped. "She didn't turn around, mister," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I did not ask for your help." "No, ma'am." His voice was quiet, low, from the back of his chest. "You didn't? I don't like owing people." "You don't owe me anything, Miss Hartwell." That stopped her. He knew her name. She hadn't given it. "A man doesn't get to put a debt on a woman," he said, for doing what any decent soul in that room should have done 10 minutes ago. She closed her eyes. She did not let him see it. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening, ma'am." She walked out. The summer heat hit her first. The sound came second. The sound of the saloon behind her, which was not laughing anymore, which was in fact very quiet. The kind of quiet a room makes when 20 men are looking at one another and trying to decide what just happened and who is responsible for it. She made it 3 steps into the street before her knees tried to give. She did not let them. She walked 1 block, then another. At the corner, she turned off Main Street into the alley behind the Fiji store. And only then, only when no window looked out and no door stood open, did she press her forehead against the dry wooden wall and let one single hard breath come out of her. Awe. 1 breath. That was all she would give them. She wiped her lip with the back of her hand, looked at her palm, at the scrapes still damp and raw, at the blood dried into the crease of her fist where her own nails had cut. "All right then," she said, to nobody. To the alley, to the town, to her father, maybe, if he was still listening from wherever he'd gone. "All right, Redstone. You want to see what a ranch girl does when she gets up off the floor?" She straightened, pushed herself off the wall. "You'll see it." Half a block behind her in the doorway of Coldwater Saloon. The scarred man stood still in the evening light and watched her go. He did not follow. He only watched, his glass still behind him on the bar, his coat settling around him in the warm air, and after a long moment he took off his hat, turned it once, slow, in both hands, set it back on his head. The way a man sets a hat back on his head when he's just made a decision he's been putting off for a while. The ride back to Hartwell Ridge took Naomi longer than it should have. Halfway home, she had to stop and be sick into the roadside grass. Then sit down beside her horse in the dark and wait for her hands to stop shaking enough to hold the reins. She did not give them that either. She just waited. When she finally came up the rutted track toward her own gate, the moon was already pulling itself over the eastern ridge, and the cicadas were loud in the dry grass, and Ethan Cole was sitting on the top rail of the corral fence with a rifle across his knees like he'd been sitting there for a long time. "Miss Naomi?" "Ethan." He slid off the fence, 19 years old, long-limbed and careful-footed in the dark. He'd worked the ridge since he was 12, since before Jonas got sick, since before a lot of things. He looked at her face, at her lip, at the torn shoulder of her coat. Who? He said. Not a question, Jack Vance. He went very still. Marsh's man, he said. Yes, in the saloon, in front of the whole town. His jaw worked. His hands found the rifle, and his knuckles went white around it, and he turned toward the gate like he had somewhere to be. Naomi put her hand flat on the barrel and pushed it gently down. No, Ethan. Miss Naomi. No. You're not riding into Redstone tonight with a rifle for me. I did not come home to bury another man who worked my father's land. He swallowed. He looked away toward the dark shape of the barn. His throat moved again. Miss Naomi, he said after a moment. There were riders. She went still. When? Around sundown. Before you left this morning, even. 3 of them. They didn't come up to the house. They rode along the south fence, slow, stopped at the dry well. One man got down and walked the fence line, maybe 10 minutes. Then they all rode back out the way they came. Did they see you? No, ma'am. I was in the hayloft. Did you recognize any of them? Ethan wet his lips. One, he said. Which one? Vance. She stood there in the dark holding the rifle barrel and thinking. Vance was in the saloon at dusk. That meant he'd sent those riders out before he even got there. Before she walked through that door. He knew she would be gone. He knew the ridge would be empty. This was not a man who had decided on impulse to put his boot on a woman who accused him of cheating at cards. This was a man who had already been to her fence line, already been to her dry well. Ethan, she said. Yes. Ma'am, you're not to leave this place until sunup, not for any reason. You stay on that porch with that rifle and you stay awake. And if anybody comes up this track tonight that isn't me or the doctor, I'll fire once in the air, then run for the root cellar. She looked at him. How did you know I was going to say that? Because you told me the same thing 2 years ago, when those cattle thieves were working the South County. And because you're your father's daughter? He paused. He used to say the same thing. Fire a warning, then survive long enough to tell somebody what happened. That's the whole job. She was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. That's exactly right. That's the whole job. Inside, she lit one lamp. No more. She washed her face at the basin, and the water in the bowl went a color she didn't look at twice. She took out the hairpins one by one, the way her mother had taught her, and set them in a neat row on the dresser. Took off the torn coat, folded it, set it aside to mend. She put on one of her father's old work shirts, faded blue flannel. It smelled like the cedar of his wardrobe and faintly, impossibly, like pipe tobacco. Even though he'd stopped smoking 2 winters before he died, she had to sit down on the edge of the bed and breathe through her teeth for a minute. Just a minute. Then she got up. She went to the kitchen, sat at the table, opened the ledger, the one Jonas had used for ranch accounts, the one she'd taken over when he got too sick to hold a pen, and she turned to a fresh page. She wrote in her small, careful hand, July 14, 1886. Evening. Coldwater Saloon, Redstone, Colorado Territory. Assaulted by one Jack Vance. Known employee of Mr. Gideon Marsh. Witnessed by approximately 20 men, including Sheriff Harlow Pruitt and Mr. Holt Holloway, proprietor. No intervention from any person of authority. She paused. Intervention by one Silas Boone. She stopped, looked at what she'd written, Mountain Man. Scar along left jaw. Bearskin coat. Knew my father's name. She set out down the same day evening. 3 riders observed along south fence line by Ethan Cole. One identified as Vance. Dismounted at dry well. Walked fence line approximately 10 minutes. She closed the ledger. Her father had told her once, sitting at this very table when she was about 8 years old, and had just watched him spend an hour writing down every detail of a land dispute that ended up nowhere. Girl, the law doesn't remember for you. You remember for yourself. And when the day comes that you need to speak, you speak from pages, not from memory. She put the ledger under her pillow. She did not sleep. She lay in her father's bed, in her father's house, in the shirt that smelled like his cedar wardrobe, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about her mother. Eleanor Hartwell had died in a buggy accident in the spring of 1868. Naomi had been 8 years old. The horse had spooked on the Bent Fork Road. The story went, and the buggy had gone down a grade, and Eleanor had been thrown. And by the time anyone found her, it was already too late. Naomi had grown up with that story, had grown up with the image of her mother's gentle mare, a bay with a white star, a horse so even-tempered, it would stand still for a barn cat to walk under its belly suddenly, for no known reason, throwing itself into a panic on a road it had traveled 100 times. She had wondered about it sometimes, privately, the way you wonder about a thing you're not sure you're allowed to wonder about. She closed her eyes, and then she opened them again because she was not going to sleep anyway. And staring at the ceiling was at least something to do. The ledger was under her pillow. She reached under and touched the spine of it. Just touched it, left her hand there, breathed. Morning came in hard and bright, the way it always came in July in the valley. By the time the rooster started up, Naomi was already dressed and already out at the south fence in her father's old work trousers and his heaviest boots, looking at exactly what 3 men on horseback had stopped to look at the evening before. The wire was cut, not broken, not rusted through, cut. Clean diagonal snips, 4 of them, the ends bent back and tucked into the brush, so you wouldn't see them from horseback unless you were looking specifically. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth near the dry well, and the gate into the north pasture, the gate Jonas had built with his own hands 16 years ago, the gate that let the cattle get to the good shade and the standing water. When the south pasture dried up in late summer, that gate had been wired shut from the outside. With the wire cut from her own south fence the evening before, she crouched in the dust, tracing the edge of one boot print with one finger, thinking about the 3 cattle she'd need to check on before the morning got too hot. When she heard hooves coming up the road, she didn't stand up, didn't turn around. She already knew Miss Hartwell. She stood, brushed the dust off her knees, turned. He was on a tall buckskin horse and the morning sun was behind him, so she couldn't see his face clearly. The bearskin coat looked darker in daylight, heavier. His hat was pushed back on his head. "Mr. Boone," she said, because she knew his name now. Holloway had told it to half the county by midnight, she imagined. The name Silas Boone, and the name had done something in the room when he said it. She'd noticed that, even from the floor. 2 of the older men at the back had straightened up. "You see the fence," he said. "I see it. And the gate, I see that too." She looked up at him. The sun was still behind him. "I didn't invite you out here, Mr. Boone." "No, ma'am." "Then why are you here?" He was quiet a moment. Then, "Because I figured a woman walking her fence at sunup the morning after what happened last night ought to have somebody close by who can count to 3. She almost smiled. She caught it before it reached her face. "Get down off that horse, Mr. Boone." He got down, up close, in daylight, without the adrenaline and the floor and the 20 men laughing. She could see him properly for the first time. The scar was older than she'd thought, long-heeled, silvered white, against the weathered skin of his jaw. His hands were rough in the particular way of a man who works with them constantly, not just seasonally. There were calluses on his palms, in places you only get from rope and axe and the kind of daily labor that doesn't take Sundays off. He looked at the fence without her having to show him where. Walked the line. Crouched where she'd crouched. Looked at the boot prints. 3 men, he said. The middle one's heavier. "See how the heel sinks deeper," I noticed. He glanced back at her. "My father taught me to read prints," she said. Said it was more reliable than most men. Something shifted in his face. Too quick to read. He stood up. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "I'll give you water for your horse." She stopped. Looked at him. "That's my line." He had the grace to look almost chastened. "Come on then," she said. "Water for your horse. Coffee if you'll drink it black, and one question." One answer. She turned toward the house. But I will not give you a job. I will not give you a place on this land, and I will not give you any part of what my father built. She looked back over her shoulder. Are we clear, Mr. Boone? Clear as glass, Miss Hartwell. Good. At the kitchen table, over coffee black enough to be borderline hostile, she asked her one question. Why did you stand up? He held the cup in both hands. Not drinking, just holding. Like the heat of it was a kind of anchor. He looked at the table for a long time. Then he looked at her. There was a woman, he said. 19 years old. Name was Abigail. Father was a corporal I served with before. He stopped. Chose differently. A long time ago. I was 25, sitting in a room full of men who outranked me and outweighed me, and I told myself it wasn't my fight. He set the cup down. She didn't live through the night. Naomi said nothing. I went up into the mountains after that. Not right after. But eventually he looked at his hands. You can't drink a thing like that out of your head. I tried for 15 years. Last night I finally figured out the only way through is through. Stand up the next time. Even if the next time is 15 years late. She was quiet for a long while. That's more than one answer, Mr. Boone. Yes, ma'am. It is. I won't hold it against you, obliged. She set down her cup. The wire was cut, she said. Yes. 3 riders along the south fence at sundown yesterday. My hand saw them from the hayloft. One of them was Vance. Silas set his cup down. Slowly, you're certain. My hand is 19 years old, and has never told me a lie. She looked at him steadily. That's not a man trying to bully me into selling a brooch, Mr. Boone. A man doesn't walk someone else's fence line while she's not on it unless he's measuring something. No, ma'am, somebody has been deciding I'm cheap for a while now. I just didn't know it until somebody put a boot on me. She folded her hands on the table. I need someone to go back into Redstone this afternoon. Sit at Holloway's bar. Order 1 drink. Nurse it for 3 hours. And listen to every word anyone connected to Gideon Marsh says within 10 feet of them. She looked at him. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. And Mr. Boone, yes. You will not put your hand on your gun today. Not once. Not for any reason. Not for anything you see or hear. He was quiet. Swear it, she said. On my father's name. Since you knew him, he looked at her then. Really looked. Like he was reading something in her face he hadn't expected to find. On Jonas Hartwell's name, he said. I will not draw today. Good. She pushed back her chair. Then go. When he had ridden back out the gate. When the sound of the buckskin's hooves had faded down toward the road, Ethan came around the corner of the barn and stood at the fence watching the dust settle. Who was that? He said. Silas Boone. Ethan turned that over. The name did something in the saloon last night, didn't it? She looked at him. How do you know that? Ned Briggs rode out this morning before you got up. Told me everything. She was quiet a moment. And you didn't think to mention that before? You were looking at boot prints. He shrugged. A 19-year-old, trying very hard to be as useful as a 25-year-old. Seemed like you wanted to look at boot prints first. She was quiet another moment. Ethan Cole. She said, Miss Naomi, you're smarter than you look. Yes, ma'am, he said. I've been told. The sun moved. The morning went to noon. Naomi was in the ledger at the kitchen table, copying the deed survey from her father's papers, making a duplicate in her own hand, when she heard a horse coming up the track. Not Silas, too soon, and the stride was different. Heavier, slower. She was at the door before the rider reached the gate, a woman on a gray mule, mid-40s. Had been handsome once, and had clearly decided at some point that handsome was more trouble than it was worth. Practical hat, practical dress, the kind of face that has heard everything and filed most of it away for later. June Aldridge. She ran the rooms above the general store on the east side of Main Street. She knew every secret in Redstone the way a river knows every stone in its bed. She'd never once volunteered one of those secrets to anyone. Until today, she slid off the mule before it had quite stopped. Crossed the yard in 4 fast stride rides. Grabbed Naomi's wrist, Miss Hartwell, Miss Aldridge, Naomi kept her voice even. You rode out here alone. From town I did. At noon I did. June pulled her toward the door. Inside. I need inside. At the kitchen table. June Aldridge sat with her hands pressed flat on the wood and told Naomi about the evening 3 nights before, when Gideon Marsh had rented the private room above her dining hall. 4 men. With him, Vance was one. The county clerk from Bent Fork was another. She didn't know the other 2 by name but knew their coats. The cut of them, Kansas City money. She'd served them supper. Left the room. But the stovepipe between the private room and her pantry carried, sound the way a tin cup carries water. And she'd heard everything they said for nearly 2 hours. She told Naomi all of it. The railroad survey out of Kansas City. A spur line coming south through the valley the following spring. And the route running straight across Hartwell Ridge, because Hartwell Ridge had the only gentle grade and the only reliable water source on the south side of the county, the forged debt claim. The county clerk with cash in his pocket and a stamp in his drawer. The auction. The sale. Naomi sat with her hands flat on the table and listened to all of it. When June finished, she did not speak immediately. Then, this isn't about a brooch. No, Miss Hartwell. This isn't even about a ranch. No. June looked at her steadily. You're sitting on a fortune you didn't know you had. Your father didn't know either. Nobody in this valley knew. Marsh knew because he paid someone in Kansas City to know. And he's been laying the ground for this since before Jonas took sick. Naomi looked at the ledger. At her father's handwriting on the old pages, neat and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who trusted his land and his neighbors and his God, and had been wrong about at least 2 of those, Miss Hartwell. June's voice changed, softened just slightly, which from June Aldridge meant something. I'm not a brave woman. I want you to understand that before you thank me for anything. I have a lease Holloway can break any time he wants. I have a niece in St. Louis who depends on what I send her. I have stayed alive in this town for 12 years by knowing exactly when to keep my mouth shut. I understand, Naomi said. Do you understand why I'm here anyway? Naomi looked at her. Tell me. June's was quiet a moment. Your father, she said, stood up for me in a room full of men 7 years ago, when I was being cheated on a room contract, and he did it without being asked and without expecting anything back. He was the only man in this town who ever did a thing like that for me. She met Naomi's eyes. I never forgot it, and I was not going to sit in that room above the feed store and let his daughter be emptied. Out of everything he left her while I did nothing. Naomi did not speak for a moment. One more thing. June said, the scarred man. From last night, Silas Boone, I don't know that name, but I know this. If he's staying in this valley, Marsh will send men for him before the week is out. Last night, Vance rode from your south fence straight to Marsh's house. Didn't come back out until near sunrise. And I know that, she said, forestalling the question, because my nephew tends Marsh's stable, and he counts horses for me when I ask him to. Naomi closed her eyes. Thank you, Miss Aldridge. Don't thank me yet, June said. Thank me when this is over. If either one of us is still standing, and she got back on her mule and rode down the track without looking back once. Naomi sat on the top step of her father's porch for a long time. The afternoon heat sat heavy on the valley. Somewhere behind the barn, Ethan was splitting wood. The rhythmic sound of it, crack, stack, was the most ordinary thing in the world, and she held on to it. She looked at the dry well where Vance had walked the fence line. She looked at the north pasture where the gate was wired shut. She looked at the road that went into Redstone, where a scarred man on a buckskin horse was sitting at a bar right now, nursing a drink, listening. A railroad. She said the word quietly to herself, to the empty yard. A railroad? It sat strangely in her mouth, the way large things do when you first understand their actual size. Ethan came around the corner with the axe still in his hand, and stopped when he saw her face. He had learned, in 7 years of working this land, to read the difference between the faces Naomi made. Miss Naomi. he said carefully. She looked at him. This boy who had grown up on her father's land, who didn't yet know that everything he'd grown up inside of was about to be bought and sold out from under him by men who'd never laid eyes on any of them. "Ethan?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "How fast can you ride to Bent Fork?" He straightened. 2 days easy. 1 day hard. We're not killing the horse, she said. But we're also not going easy. She stood up. You'll leave before sunup tomorrow. You'll go to the telegraph office first, then to the office of the Bent Fork Courier, and you'll ask for the editor by name. Man named Orrin Hadley. You'll tell him your name and mine. And what you saw at the south fence yesterday. Yes, ma'am. And Ethan. Yes. Ma'am, if anyone on that road asks you where you're going. She paused. Do you have any family in Bent Fork? He thought for a moment. My mother had a cousin there. She's been dead 6 years, though, her husband. Last I heard, he was still living. Runs a small mill outside of town. What's his name? William Carr. William Carr, she repeated. If anyone asks, you're going to pay your respects to your Uncle William, who isn't well. Can you remember that? William Carr, not well. Going to pay respects, he nodded. Yes, ma'am, good. She looked at him steadily. The afternoon light was on his young face, and she thought, not for the first time, that he looked more like his father every year, though she'd only seen a daguerreotype of the man once. Ethan Cole, she said. Miss Naomi, are we in trouble? He looked right back at her, 19 years old, axe still in his hand. Yes, ma'am, I believe we are. I need you to be a man by the time you come back from Bent Fork, she said. The rest of the way a man. Because I don't have time to finish raising you and I need what you'll be. On the other side of that ride, he swallowed once. Then he nodded. Yes, ma'am, go get some rest. You leave before first light, he went. The sun dropped toward the western ridge. Naomi went inside, sat at the table, opened the ledger, and she wrote, in her small, careful hand, in ink that dried dark and did not fade, every word June Aldridge had said to her that afternoon. Every detail, the private room, the stovepipe, the railroad survey, the forged debt claim, the clerk from Bent Fork with cash in his pocket, every name, every date. Her father's voice in her head, steady as the creek in spring. The law doesn't remember for you. You remember for yourself. And when the day comes that you need to speak, you speak from pages. She was still writing when she heard the horse coming up the track, Silas Boone. Back from Redstone. Dusk settling over the valley like a slow breath. She closed the ledger, put it under her arm, walked to the door. He didn't know yet, she thought. He didn't know that what they were standing in had grown 100 times larger than a boot on a saloon floor. He thought he was coming back to report on an hour of overheard conversation in a country saloon. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. He was still at the gate. She raised one hand. Come in, he came, and Naomi Hartwell. 26 years old, daughter of Jonas and Eleanor Hartwell, sole owner and operator of Hartwell Ridge, and everything it sat on top of, stood on her father's porch in the long evening light and waited for a mountain man to bring her word of the war that was already coming. She was still writing things down. She was ready. Silas came up the track at dusk the way he said he would, alone, which was the first thing Naomi noticed. Because she'd half expected him to bring trouble back with him the way a boot brings mud. Instead, he rode in quiet, the buckskin moving slow, his hat pushed back, his hands loose on the reins. She was on the porch with the ledger under her arm and her father's rifle, leaning against the post beside her. She did not pick it up, but she did not move away from it either. He swung down at the gate, looped the reins, walked up to the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, which she noted. He did not come up without being asked, Miss Hartwell. Mr. Boone, she looked at his face. He had the particular stillness of a man who had heard something he was still digesting. Come in, she said. I have things to tell you, and then you'll have things to tell me, and then we'll need paper. He came in, she told him about June Aldridge first. All of it, the private room, the stovepipe. The 2 hours of conversation June had stood in her pantry, and listened to, one hand pressed flat against the wall to feel when the floorboards shifted. The railroad survey. Silas sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Most men, when told that the ground under someone's feet was worth a fortune, started asking about the money. Silas looked at the table, like he was calculating something different. He's been planning this since before your father took sick, Silas said. Before Jonas knew he was sick, she corrected. There's a difference. Silas looked up at her. Marsh knew the survey was coming, she said. Knew it a year before anybody in this valley had heard a word about a spur line. That means he needed the land locked down before the news got out, and he needed it to look clean. She opened the ledger to the page she'd written that afternoon, which means the debt claim they're filing at the end of this month has been in preparation for longer than my father was in the ground. Silas was quiet. Now, she said. What did you hear in Redstone, he told her. 3 hours at Holloway's bar. 1 drink, nursed slow. 2 of Marsh's men at the back table, young ones. The kind who talked because they didn't yet know enough to know not to. Silas had sat 7 stools down and stared at his glass and let the room forget he was in it, which was apparently something he had considerable practice at. The 2 men talked about the 22nd. Not what would happen on the 22nd. Just the date itself, mentioned 3 times, in ways that weren't quite casual enough. Like a word someone keeps touching with their tongue, because there's something stuck in their teeth. The 22nd was 8 days from now. They're moving faster than I expected, Naomi said. They're moving, Silas said. Like men who think they've already won, she looked at him. That's a different problem, he said. Careful men hedge. Men who think they've won get sloppy. Or bold, she said, or both. She wrote the date in the ledger. July 22, circled it, looked at it. 8 days, Mr. Boone, she said. I need Ethan in Bent Fork by the day after tomorrow. I need a telegraph sent to the federal marshal's office in Wichita, and I need him back here before the 20th. She looked up. Can you ride with him as far as the Bitter Creek Pass and make sure he gets there without company? Yes, ma'am, and then come back. He looked at her a moment. You want me to come back? I want you to come back, she confirmed. Because whatever is happening on the 22nd, I would like at least one person in my yard that night who has survived a situation of equivalent complexity. Something in his face moved. Just slightly. I'll ride out with the boy at first light, he said. Be back by the 19th. Good, she closed the ledger. There's a room off the barn that was my father's when he needed quiet. It's clean and dry. You're welcome to it, much obliged. It's not hospitality, she said. Not unkindly, just clearly. It's logistics. Don't read anything into it. No, ma'am. Good night, Mr. Boone. Good night, Miss Hartwell. Silas and Ethan left before first light. Naomi stood at the gate and watched them go. 2 shapes on horseback, moving fast and quiet, into the gray before sunrise, the sound of them fading quickly into the dry grass and the early morning birds. She stood there until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she went back inside and got to work. July 15th was the fence and the dead cattle and the wired gate. July 16th was Sheriff Harlow Pruitt. She didn't go to him. He came to her. Around noon, she was in the north pasture, checking the water in the remaining trough, when she heard a horse on the track, slow pace. Not evasive, not urgent. The pace of a man who'd made up his mind about something, and was no longer sure he was glad he had. She walked back to the fence line and waited. Pruitt came through the gate with his hat already in his hand. His badge, she noticed, was pinned straight today, square to the light. Like he'd taken it off and put it back on differently this morning. His face was the color of creek clay after a flood. Miss Hartwell, sheriff. She did not open the gate for him. He got down and tied his horse to the post and came to stand on the other side of the fence, and she stayed where she was. I owe you something, he said. Yes, sir, you do. He looked at his hat. Then at her. He was 50 years old, and he looked older today. My wife told me last night that if I didn't ride out here and say what I came to say, she was going to the telegraph office herself and sending your name to the federal marshal in Wichita with a detailed account of what she'd seen me not do over the last 22 years. Naomi said nothing. Let him keep going. She's never threatened me like that before, he said. Not once. 22 years, he paused. I believed her. Smart man, Naomi said. He nodded like he deserved that. 3 weeks ago, he said, Marsh came to my house. After supper, my wife was putting the children to bed. He described the kitchen table, the envelope, the $400 he hadn't touched. The words Marsh had said, when a certain piece of paper comes through the county office at the end of this month, you will serve it, and you will not ask what's on it. He described the smile Marsh had left wearing. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. And Marsh, he stopped. Marsh didn't need me to. That was the part that kept me up at night. Naomi looked at him steadily. What's happening on the 22nd, Harlow? He flinched slightly at his first name from her. Deserved that too? He's going to burn the ranch, he said. Quiet, like saying it quietly, made it slightly less terrible. On the night of the 22nd, with you inside the house. The forged debt claim is already written. It'll be sitting on his lawyer's desk in Bent Fork with a filing date 2 weeks before the fire. Land transfers to his holding as a matter of settled paper. And there won't be a living Hartwell left to dispute it. The north pasture was very quiet, wind in the dry grass. A hawk somewhere high into the east. Ethan, she said, excuse me? My hand. Ethan Cole, Pruitt's jaw worked. One boy? He said. I may have told Vance there was one ranch hand. When Vance asked me, she breathed through that. When did Vance ask you? Yesterday afternoon. He came to my office. 2 men with him. Coats from somewhere else. He looked at his hat again. He asked where Silas Boone was staying. I said I didn't know. He asked how many hands you ran. I said 1 boy. He paused. He asked me if your father had ever filed a formal survey on the spring line in the south pasture. And? I said I'd find out by this morning. And did you? No. He looked at her directly. Because my wife was standing in the kitchen doorway when I came home from that conversation, and she looked at my face, and she knew, and then she told me about the 22 years. He swallowed. The money is still in the barn under the loose board, every cent of it. Untouched, she looked at him for a long moment. What do you want me to do about it, Harlow? Tell me, he said. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. That's a big statement. I know what it is, she considered. Go back to Redstone. Sit at your desk. When Vance's men come to check, you're there. When Vance asks if Boone has ridden out, you tell him yes. When he asks if the Cowboy is still here, you tell him yes. You answer every question they put to you with exactly the lie keeps me alive until the 22nd. She opened the gate. And then on the night of the 22nd, when Marsh sits down at Holloway's bar to play his hand of cards, she looked at Pruitt's belt, at the cuffs hanging there. You're going to stand up, and you're going to put those on him yourself. Pruitt's throat worked. Do you understand me, she said. Yes, ma'am. Swear it on my children, he said, without hesitation. I swear it on my children. She stepped back, then right out. And Harlow, he paused at his horse. Thank your wife for me, he rode. She stood in the yard after he left and looked at the dry well where Vance had walked her fence line. Then she went inside and wrote it all in the ledger. Every word, every name. The $400 under the loose board, the clerk in Bent Fork. The 22nd, she wrote it carefully, methodically, in the small hand her father had taught her and her mother had corrected and years of ranch bookkeeping had made precise. Like a woman who has learned that the pen is the thing you pick up when everything else has been taken from you, because it was the one thing nobody had thought to take. July 18th, she was repairing the gate hinges in the north pasture when she heard June Aldridge's mule come up the road. What? She knew the sound of it by now. The particular unrhythmic clop of a mule that had opinions about its schedule. She set down the wrench, waited. June came through the gate, and slid off the mule, with the efficiency of a woman who had been getting on and off animals all her life and had long since stopped performing the dismount for an audience. She had a leather satchel over her shoulder. She sat down on the fence rail, opened the satchel, and laid it on her knees. 41 pages of handwritten notes. Naomi looked at them. Then she looked at June. "How long?" she said. 3 years. June's voice was steady. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed this conversation in her head enough times that the actual version was just a formality, 1 page at a time. Every time Marsh rented the private room and stood up to use the facilities, I had between 8 and 12 minutes. I kept a copy pen in the pantry. I put every page back before he came out. Naomi touched the edge of the top page. "This is every IOU he holds in this valley that I could find. 41 pages. 11 years, she paused. The blacksmith is on page 3. 2 church elders on page 5. The postmaster on page 9. Naomi looked up. "And Holloway," Junson said. Page 14. Written in his own hand. A percentage of the saloon promised to Marsh in exchange for a debt forgiven in April of 1879. The yard was quiet. A fly landed on the fence post and moved on, Miss Aldridge, Naomi said. "You could have been hanged for this, I know. Why?" June was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that has a lot inside it. "My husband borrowed $400 from Gideon Marsh in 1871, she said finally. He couldn't pay it back. Marsh took it out of him in a back room of that saloon on a Tuesday evening in November. She looked at the satchel. "My husband came home and sat at our kitchen table for 2 hours and didn't speak. Then he walked out to the barn." She stopped. Restarted. "Marsh sent me a note the following week forgiving the debt. Like it was a Christmas gift." She looked at Naomi. "I have been waiting 11 years for the day I could put that note in front of a federal judge, with 40 pages behind it." Naomi did not speak for a moment. Then she reached out and put her hand flat over June's on the satchel. Not a grip, just a hand, laid flat. "The way you put a hand on something you are making a promise about. That day," Naomi said, "is coming." June nodded once, sharp, like she was closing a clasp. "One more thing," June said. "The scarred man. Boone, he's gone to Bent Fork with Ethan. Good. Because Vance rode straight from your south fence to Marsh's house the night of the 14th. Didn't come back out until sunrise." She picked up the satchel. "Marsh knows Boone was in that saloon. And Marsh, in my experience, does not leave a man standing in a room once he's decided that man is a problem." She got back on the mule. "Miss Aldridge," Naomi said. "Miss Hartwell, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," June said. "Thank me when this is over. If we're both still here when it's over." She turned the mule. "I'll be in touch," she rode. That night, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and June's satchel and the deed survey and 3 years' worth of ranch accounts. And she built something that looked less like a plan and more like a map, not a map of land. A map of people. Who was where, who owed what, who was afraid of what, and who had decided they were done being afraid. She worked until past midnight. The lamp burned low and she trimmed it and kept going. By the time she went to bed, she had 7 names written at the bottom of a fresh ledger page. 7 names and 7 questions. And she had answers for 4 of them, 3 to go. July 19th, Silas came back. She heard the buckskin on the road in the late afternoon, and she was at the gate before he reached it, which she told herself was entirely practical, and had nothing to do with the fact that the yard had felt too large and too quiet for the last 4 days. He swung down, looked at her. Read her face the way he'd read the boot prints at the dry well. "You've had a full week," he said. "You've been gone 4 days. Those aren't mutually exclusive." She almost smiled. "Caught it. Come in. I need to show you what I've found." She showed him everything. June's satchel. The 41 pages. The names. Pruitt's confession. The date circled in the ledger. Silas sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at it all. Not quickly. He took his time. Read the relevant pages. Looked at the names. Looked at the map she'd drawn of the ranch, with the fence lines and the dry well marked. When he finished, he sat back. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been precise," she corrected. Busy implies disorganization. He looked at her. Something in his face that wasn't quite a smile. Jonas used to say something like that. She stopped. He'd say. Silas paused. He'd say there was a difference between working hard and working right. He said most men confused the two. She was quiet for a moment. "You knew him well." "Not well," Silas said, "but long enough to recognize him in you." He looked at the ledger. "He'd be." He stopped again. "Don't," she said. Gently. "Don't tell me what he'd be. I know what he'd be. I need to know what comes next." He nodded. "Fair, the 22nd, she said. "Marsh hits this ranch with how many men?" "That's what I don't know. I need to know." She pressed her fingers to the table. "Because my plan right now has 9 rifles. And 9 rifles against 3 men is different from 9 rifles against 12. Where are your 9 rifles?" She listed them. Amos Webb and his 2 sons. A widow named Clara Fenn, 2 miles east, whose husband had died of something that nobody talked about but everybody in the valley suspected. Another widow, Hattie Graves. 2 properties north, same story, older. The Fuller brothers from the neighboring spread, who owed Jonas a debt from 1878. And Ethan. 9 rifles, she said. And I need to know what I'm pointing them at before the 22nd. Silas looked at the map. "There's someone inside Marsh's house, I know. You need to get to them." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Which is why I need to tell you something about Ethan Cole." Ethan had a cousin, Dora Cole, 26 years old. She'd been cooking and keeping house for Gideon Marsh for 10 years. She'd been doing it since she was 16, which told you everything you needed to know about how she'd come to be in that position, and nothing good about anyone who'd allowed it. Ethan hadn't spoken to her directly in 6 years. Not because he didn't want to, because Dora had told him not to. Told him that if Marsh found out she had kin in the valley who talked to her, she'd be on the road in a day. And the road, for a woman in Dora's position, had very few options at either end. "She knows things," Naomi said. "She's been in that house 10 years. She knows Marsh's schedule, his habits, who rides for him and when." "She won't talk," Silas said. "She will. If Ethan asks her in the right way." Naomi opened the ledger to the page she'd prepared. "I have a sentence for him to say. Just one. And when he says it, she'll come out." Silas read the sentence. He looked up at her. "How do you know?" "Because it tells her that someone knows who she is," Naomi said. "Not what she does for Marsh. Who she is. And a woman who's been invisible for 10 years will come out of any house to hear that." He was quiet. "Mr. Boone," she said, "I need Ethan to ride to Marsh's property tonight. Alone. To the kitchen door." Silas set the ledger down slowly. "If Marsh catches him on the property, I know. That boy is dead before sunup, I know." Her voice didn't waver. "I have thought of every other way to get this information. Every single one ends with me standing in my burning house on the 22nd, not knowing who's coming through the back. I need a name. I need numbers. I need it tonight." She looked at him steadily. "And Ethan Cole is the only person in this valley who can walk to that kitchen door without Marsh's riders shooting him on sight. Because his own blood works the stove." Silas looked at her for a long time. "You're harder than I thought you were," he said. "I'm harder than I thought I was," she said. "I don't particularly enjoy it." "No," he said. "I can see that." He paused. "Does it help at all? Knowing it's the right call?" She thought about that honestly. "No," she said, "but it helps knowing it's the only one." He nodded once. Picked up the ledger. "Read the sentence again." "I'll ride with him to the edge of Marsh's property," he said. "Wait in the tree line." "Ethan goes in alone," she said. "Or Dora won't come out, I know. I'll wait in the tree line." He set the ledger back down. "I'm not sending a 19-year-old boy into a killer's property, and then riding home and sitting on a porch." She looked at him. "That's not negotiable," he said, quiet. Final. The voice of a man who has decided something, and has the kind of face where decisions stay decided. She looked at him a moment longer. "All right," she said. "He found Ethan in the barn. brushing down the grulla after the hard ride back from Bent Fork. He looked up when she came in. He'd been gone 4 days, and he stood differently than when he'd left. She noticed that. The particular way a young man carries himself when he's been trusted with something real and has not dropped it. "Miss Naomi?" "Ethan." "Sit down." He sat on the feed bin. She sat across from him on an upturned crate. And she told him about Dora. He went very still, not afraid. Just still. "Processing. I haven't spoken to Dora in 6 years." He said, "I know. She told me not to contact her. I know. She was protecting herself." "I know that too." Naomi looked at him directly. "And I would not ask you to undo that protection if there was another way." "There isn't." She held out the ledger, open to the sentence she'd written. "You say this. Exactly this. Not a word different. And then you wait." He read it. She watched his face while he read. He read it twice. His jaw worked. His eyes went somewhere distant for a moment, then came back. "She'll come out," he said. Not a question. Yes, he was quiet. Then, "She's going to be scared. She's going to be terrified," Naomi said. "But she's going to talk. Because this is the first time in 10 years that anyone from outside that house has reminded her that she exists." He looked at the sentence one more time. "When do I leave?" "After dark," she said. "Mr. Boone rides with you to the tree line." He nodded. Set the ledger down carefully on the feed bin like it was something breakable, stood up, and then before he turned away, he said, "My dad used to say that the hardest thing wasn't knowing what was right. It was doing it when it cost you something." Naomi looked at him. "Did your father say that often?" she said. "Before he died, yeah." He picked up the brush. "He said it a lot. I didn't understand it then." He started brushing the horse again. "I think I'm starting to." July 19th, the night Naomi sat on the porch with the rifle across her knees, and the lamp in the kitchen turned low. She could see it from here, the yellow square of it in the window, her father's kitchen, her mother's curtains, the table where she'd written everything down. She thought about Silas out there in the tree line on the edge of Marcia's property. Not because she'd asked him, because he'd decided it himself. The mountain doesn't judge. "That's why I stayed." She thought about a man spending 15 years in the mountains because he couldn't forgive himself for a single night. And then deciding, at 47 years old, to come back down for a dead man's grave. And staying for a live woman's fight. She stayed on that thought for a moment, turned it over the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. Then she set it down, later. That particular thought was for later. Right now, there was a 19-year-old boy at the kitchen door of a dangerous man's house saying a sentence she had written, and she needed to be here. Present. Alert, she breathed, watched the road, waited. 2 hours past midnight, she heard hooves, walking pace. Like, she'd told him, a galloping horse at 2 in the morning was a horse running from something. And she'd told Ethan she didn't want Marcia's lookouts, hearing running hooves going in the direction of Hartwell Ridge. He came through the gate. She was off the porch and across the yard before he dismounted. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No, ma'am." "Did anyone see you?" "No." "Ma'am, did she come out?" He slid down. His face was wet, just around the eyes. He wiped it with the back of his hand like he was wiping off trail dust. "She came out," he said. "Tell me," he told her, standing in the yard, in the dark, with Silas Boone behind him, and the cicadas going in the dry grass, and the lamp still burning low in the kitchen window. Ethan Cole told her everything Dora Cole had said at the woodpile of Gideon Marsh's house, holding a lantern, crying without sound, talking fast, because she didn't have long before the cook noticed she'd gone. Not 3 men, not 5. 14 8 hired guns from Dodge City, arrived 2 at a time on the afternoon stage over the past 10 days, sleeping in the outbuilding behind the main house. Nobody in town had seen their faces yet because Marsh had told them to stay put, and Marsh himself would not ride on the 22nd. Marsh would be at Holloway's Saloon, playing cards, with 20 witnesses, because Marsh never put his hands on anything he paid someone else to put their hands on. Naomi absorbed this. One more thing, Ethan said. The man leading the 8 hired guns. The man Marsh had chosen specifically for this job. His name was Tom Riker. From Abilene, Naomi didn't know the name, but she turned to look at Silas. Silas had gone very still. The particular stillness of a man who has heard a word he wasn't expecting and is taking a moment to catch up with all the things it means. "Mr. Boone," she said carefully. He didn't answer immediately. "Silas." He looked at her. His eyes were steady, but something behind them was not. "Tom Riker," he said, quietly. "Shot me in Kansas in 1864. Left me in a ditch. The yard was very quiet." "He thinks you're dead," she said. "Yes." "Ma'am?" "He's been writing for Marsh." Apparently, she looked at him for a long moment. "I'm releasing you from your oath," she said. "The one about not drawing. If Tom Riker comes up my back trail on the 22nd, I'll take his knees," Silas said. Before she finished, "Not his life." "You want him alive," she stopped. He looked at her. "You want him in front of a federal judge, because he knows where every body Marsh has ever put in the ground is." She looked at him. "That's right, I know," he said. "I figured that out about 4 seconds after Ethan said the name." He looked at the barn, then back at her. "I'll take his knees, swear it, on Jonas Hartwell's name," he said. "I will take his knees and bring him in alive." "Good." She turned back toward the house. "Come inside, both of you. We need paper. Because the plan we've been running for the last 4 days is not the plan we're running on the 22nd. She stopped at the door, looked back at Silas, who was still standing in the yard looking at nothing in particular. "Mr. Boone," he looked at her. "The mountain kept you for 15 years, she said. And that was its own kind of thing. But you came down. And that matters." He didn't answer. She went inside. After a moment, she heard his boots on the porch steps. He came in. They worked until nearly 4 in the morning, at the kitchen table. The lamp between them. June's satchel to one side, the ledger open in the middle. Naomi drew the map she'd been building in her head for 3 days. The whole ridge, every fence line and every gully, and every rise, and every stand of cottonwood, and every place where a man on horseback could approach without being seen. She put 7 small marks on the map, 7 positions. She wrote a name beside each one, and beside each name a set of instructions. Because she'd had 4 days to think about this while Silas was in Bent Fork. With Ethan and June was keeping her mouth shut in town, and Pruitt was sitting behind his desk, trying to look like a man who had been bought. And what she'd understood, lying awake those 4 nights, with the ledger under her pillow, was that Marsh was going to split his men. Of course, he was going to hit the Webb farm first. Light the hay barn. Draw every rifle on Hartwell Ridge toward the smoke. And while the porch emptied out toward the Webb place, the 8 men from Dodge would come up the back trail. So she was going to split her people too. "Webb's people need to know," Silas said. "I'm writing to Amos first thing tomorrow morning," she said. "He'll have his boys and the neighboring family positioned before sundown." She paused. "And he'll have Hattie Graves." Silas looked at her over the lamp. Hattie Graves, 63 years old. Lost her husband to Marsh's business 12 years ago. Has her own rifle, her own bedroll, and was waiting for exactly this kind of evening. Naomi looked at the map. "I don't need Amos's barn untouched. I need Marsh's 6 men who set the fire to not make it back to the main road." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're not who I expected," he said. She looked up. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "A woman, trying to hold on to something." "I am trying to hold on to something." "No," he said. "You're trying to take something back." He paused. "That's different." She looked at it. The lamp between them burned low and steady. "My mother died in a ditch on the Bent Fork Road," she said. "Alone, with nobody looking for her. Because a man wanted a piece of paper and she said no." She looked at the map, at the 7 marks, at the names beside them. "I'm not trying to hold on, Mr. Boone. I'm trying to make sure that nobody in this valley ever confuses silence for order again." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the cicadas. The wind in the dry summer grass. The particular stillness of the hours before dawn when everything is waiting for the sun. Then let's make sure the right men are standing in your yard when this is over, he said. She looked at him. He was serious. He was always serious. But there was something in the way he said it that was different from the other times. Like he'd made a decision, the final kind. She turned back to the map. Here, she said, and pointed. This is where you'll be. He leaned forward to look. And they worked through what was left of the night. July 21st, one day before the 22nd, at 2 in the afternoon, when the heat sat so heavy on the valley that the air above the south pasture shimmered like water, and every rifle on the porch had moved into the shade of the barn. A lone rider came up the track. Every rifle came up. Naomi was on her feet with the Winchester before she'd consciously decided to stand. That's not a marsh rider, she said. How do you know, Miss Naomi? Because Marsh's riders don't come up the middle of a track in daylight with their hands where you can see them. The rider came closer, Silas, from beside the barn. That's Pruitt, it was. He came up at a walk, hat already in his hand, face the color of wet ash. He had the look of a man who has been carrying something too long and has finally decided to put it down regardless of what it breaks when it lands. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. Miss Hartwell, he said. I'm not supposed to be here. Marsh's man is riding past my office at 4 o'clock to check I'm still at my desk. I have 90 minutes. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at him. Then say what you came to say, Harlow. He said it. He said that in 1868, Gideon Marsh had ordered a man to put a whip across the left shoulder of Eleanor Hartwell's horse on the Bent Fork Road. That Eleanor had not died of the fall, that she had died 3 hours later in a ditch, alone, of a broken neck. That by the time anyone went looking for her, it was already dark. That Jonas Hartwell had been told, the horse spooked on a downhill grade. That Pruitt had signed the coroner's finding. At 29 years old, 3 months into his badge, he said it standing at the foot of the porch steps, hat in both hands, looking at Naomi the whole time. Not looking away. Not once. The porch was completely still. Naomi stood at the top of the steps. She did not speak for a while. Silas was at the bottom of the yard. He had not moved from the post he'd been leaning against since Pruitt arrived. But his right hand, she could see from here, had come to rest on the grip of his pistol without him seeming to know it had done so. I wrote it down, Pruitt said. Every word. Signed and dated and sealed. My wife has it in her coat. She rides for Bent Fork at first light tomorrow, whether I'm sitting at my desk in the morning or not. He looked at Naomi. My wife is a harder woman than anyone in this county ever guessed. She always was. Naomi said quietly. Pruitt's eyes went briefly bright. Naomi stepped down off the porch, all the way down, and she walked up to Pruitt's horse, and she put her hand on his knee, and she looked up at him, and she said, very carefully, Harlow, you are going to live through tomorrow night. Do you hear me? Not a question. A federal marshal is coming down that road at moonrise with 6 deputies. He is going to walk into cold waters while Marsh is holding his hand of cards. And you, Harlow Pruitt, are going to stand up from that table, and you are going to walk across the room, and you are going to put those cuffs on Gideon Marsh yourself, in front of 20 men. In the same saloon where he put his man's boot on my shoulder 9 days ago. She held his gaze. Do you hear me? Pruitt's eyes were wet. He didn't look away. I hear you, Miss Hartwell. Then ride back. Sit in your chair. Wait. He put his hat on. His hands were steadier than they'd been when he arrived. He rode. When the sound of his horse had faded past the gate, Naomi stood in the middle of the yard for a long moment. She was 8 years old again, standing in the doorway of her father's kitchen on a spring evening in 1868, watching Jonas Hartwell sit at this same table, with his hands flat on the wood, and his face doing the particular thing that faces do when they are holding a grief too large for the room. She had not understood then. Not fully. She understood now. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs, looked at the sky. The late afternoon sky, still blue and high, and indifferent to everything that happened under it. My mother died alone in a ditch, because a man wanted a piece of paper. And she said no. Silas came up beside her. He didn't speak. He stood there in the yard with her and looked at the same sky and did not offer any words, which was the right thing. Which was the only thing. Actually, after a long time, she said, "Mr. Boone?" "Yes, ma'am. I need you on that back trail tomorrow night. I'll be there." "And Tom Riker?" "Knees," he said. "Alive." "Wichita," she breathed. "Good." She turned toward the house, stopped, turned back. "For what it's worth," she said. "Whatever happened in that room 15 years ago. Whatever you didn't do," she looked at him steadily. "You've been doing it now." He said nothing. But something in his face shifted, like a thing long held, finally shifting its weight. She went inside. He stood in the yard a moment longer. Then he followed. One day. One more day. Anne Naomi Hartwell. 26 years old, daughter of Jonas and Eleanor, sole owner of Hartwell Ridge, and everything it stood on and everything it meant. Sat at her kitchen table and opened the ledger and wrote in ink that would not fade. July 21, 1886. Sheriff Harlow Pruitt confirmed in person, on my porch, in front of 2 witnesses, that on the Benfork Road in the spring of 1868, my mother, Eleanor Hartwell, was murdered on the order of Gideon Marsh. She said no. He decided that was not allowed. She set down the pen, looked at the sentence. She said no. He decided that was not allowed. She picked up the pen again. He was wrong. She closed the ledger, put it under her pillow. Tomorrow, July 22nd, came in hot, hotter than any day that summer. Hot enough that by noon, the air above the south pasture shimmered like something alive. Hot enough that the rifles on the porch had moved into the shade of the barn without being asked. And the 3rd pot of coffee was already gone. And Ethan had stopped talking, which was how you knew it was serious. Because Ethan Cole had not voluntarily stopped talking since he was approximately 14 years old. 9 people on Hartwell Ridge that morning, 9 rifles. Naomi had counted them 3 times, not because she didn't trust the count, because counting was something to do with her hands, while her mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere on a back trail in the dark, somewhere at a bar in Redstone where a sheriff was sitting in a chair, trying to look like a man who had been bought. Somewhere on a road out of Wichita, where 6 federal deputies were riding hard through the Colorado heat toward a town they'd never heard of 2 weeks ago. She counted again, 9. The afternoon stretched long and hot, and Naomi did not waste it. She rode the fence line one last time. Every strand, every post. The cut wire on the south was still there, coiled on the fence post where she'd left it. Evidence. She looked at it for a moment, then rode on. At 4 o'clock, a rider from town came up the track with a folded note. Not Pruitt's handwriting. Beckford's, the marshal's, 4 words on schedule. Tonight, confirmed. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her father's shirt pocket over her heart, and buttoned the flap. Ethan found her at the water trough 20 minutes later. He looked at her face and didn't ask. He'd learned that much. Webb's people are in position, he said. Good, Hattie sent word. She's in the tree line. Good. He was quiet a moment, Miss Naomi. Are you scared? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. But not of tonight. She looked at him. Tonight I know exactly what's coming. It's the morning after that scares me. When it's over and I have to figure out what to do with the rest of it. He nodded slowly. Like he understood more than she expected. Get to your position, she said. And Ethan, yes, ma'am. You did good. All of it. He put his hat on and went. The afternoon was the longest she had ever lived through. And she had lived through some long afternoons. She went through the plan 3 times in her head. Checked each position on the map she'd drawn. Thought about Webb's barn. About Amos in the dry wash with his 2 sons and 4 other rifles. About Hattie Graves, 63 years old, who had driven her own wagon out to Hartwell Ridge 2 days ago, with her own bedroll and her own rifle and a pound of coffee, and who, when Naomi had tried to thank her, had said, "Miss Hartwell, you do not thank a woman for what she's been waiting 15 years to do." She thought about Tom Riker on that back trail, about Silas in the cottonwood, about the fact that those two men had last seen each other in Kansas in 1864, when one of them had left the other for dead. She thought about Ethan 22 hours ago, standing in the yard with a wet face and a steady voice. She thought about Dora Cole at the woodpile, with a lantern and 22 years of silence finally breaking. She thought about her mother's yellow dress. At 7 in the evening, she made herself eat something. She couldn't have said what. It tasted like nothing, and she ate it anyway, because she was going to need to be functional in 2 hours, and hunger was a variable she could control. She changed into dark clothing, braided her hair back tight, loaded the Winchester and set it against the porch post, loamed her father's short rifle and put it inside the door. And then she sat down on the top porch step, and she looked out at the valley in the long summer evening light. And she let herself, just for a moment, just one moment, think about Silas Boone. About a man who spent 15 years on a mountain because he couldn't forgive himself for a single night. About what that kind of weight does to a person. About what it takes to pick it up and carry it for that long, and then at 47 years old decide to put it down, not because someone asked him to, because he walked into a saloon and saw a woman on the floor and remembered who he was supposed to be. She looked at the gate where he'd ridden out an hour ago to take his position. She'd told him something 2 nights ago that she hadn't planned to say. Whatever you didn't do 15 years ago, you've been doing it now. She'd meant it as information, as a fact stated plainly, but the way his face had moved when she said it, just slightly, like a thing long braced, finally allowed to rest, she filed that away carefully for later. If there was a later, there was going to be a later. She decided that, sitting on the porch step in the fading summer light, with the cicadas starting up in the dry grass and the first stars just beginning to think about coming out, there was going to be a later. She was going to make sure of it. Moonrise, 9:03 by Naomi's kitchen clock. The moon came up slow and orange over the eastern ridge and painted the valley in the particular amber that made everything look like it was already a memory. Naomi was on the porch. Every rifle on the property was at its position. Webb's people were in the dry wash to the south, 2 miles off. Hattie Graves was in the tree line behind the Webb barn. 3 other people were at the 7 marks on the map, exactly where Naomi had put them. And Silas was on the back trail in the dark behind the cottonwood waiting. The valley was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't actually quiet at all, but is instead every living thing on the land holding its breath at the same time. Naomi held hers. And then, at 9:16, a red glow bloomed on the horizon to the south, Webb's barn. Right on schedule, the pull of it was immediate, physical, like a rope tied to something in her chest, yanking toward the smoke. Every rifle on the porch felt it too. She could see them. The instinct to move, to ride toward fire, to do the obvious thing. Not one of them moved because she'd told them. 3 times. In plain language with no room for interpretation, the Webb barn is not your problem. Your problem is whatever comes up the back trail. The fire climbed, orange and red against the dark sky. 2 miles south, Amos Webb's hay barn, which had taken him and his sons 3 weeks to build and was about to take Marsh's men 3 minutes to burn. Except the Webbs were not in it, and neither was the hay. Amos had moved everything out at sundown. Every bale, every animal, every piece of equipment that could be carried. What Marsh's 6 men were setting fire to tonight was an empty structure, and they didn't know yet that there were 4 rifles in the dry wash behind them. Naomi listened. That was her job right now, not to move, not to act, to listen. The fire crackled 2 miles away. The cicadas kept going. The horse in the corral shifted and blew out a breath. The moon climbed. Come on, come on. And then she heard them. 8 horses on the back trail, moving fast. No attempt at quiet now, because Marsh's people thought every rifle on this property was riding south toward smoke. They were wrong. The sound came from the northeast, the back trail that ran through the bottom of the pasture and came up behind the old cottonwood. Stand where Jonas had always said the fence would fall eventually, and he'd get to it next spring. And never did. Naomi stood up slowly from the porch step, raised the Winchester, looked toward the back trail in the dark, and waited for Silas. The first voice she heard was his, not loud, not theatrical, just said. The way he said everything, Tom Riker. The 8 horses stopped so fast, she could hear the scramble of hooves. Silence on the back trail, then a voice she didn't know, older, careful. The voice of a man who has spent a lot of years in situations where being wrong costs everything. Who's there? Silas Boone. A pause. Long enough to be significant. Silas. The voice changed. Just slightly. I left you in a Kansas ditch 22 years ago. You left me in a ditch, Silas said. The ditch didn't take. Another pause. Shorter. What do you want, Silas? Same thing I've wanted since Kansas, Silas said. For you to answer for what you've done. Get off the horse, Tom. Every man with you. Rifles on the ground. Hands where I can see them. You've got a count of 5. There are 8 of us. I can count, Tom. And you're one man. No, Silas said. I'm not. And every position lit at once. 7 lamps. 7 rifles. Coming up out of the dark brush along both sides of the back trail simultaneously. The light blooming, sudden, and blinding. And the 8 men on 8 horses found themselves sitting inside, a half-circle of leveled barrels, and faces they couldn't see behind the light. Riker looked left, looked right, dropped his rifle, got off his horse, lay face down in the dirt with his hands behind his head. 7 men followed him down, not because they were brave, because they were smart, and because somewhere off to the north they could hear, very faintly, the sound of horses moving fast on the main road. Federal horses. Right on time. Cold Water Saloon. 9:41 by the clock above the bar. Marshal Ira Beckford came through the front door with his 6 deputies behind him, and trail dust still on his coat, and he did not stop to let his eyes adjust to the light. He walked straight to the front table. Gideon Marsh was sitting there with 5 cards in his hand and a glass of whiskey at his elbow, and 20 men spread around the room who were all about to become his alibi. Beckford set the warrant on the felt, between the whiskey and the cards. Marsh looked down at it, looked up at Beckford, looked at the 6 deputies flanking him, looked at Harlow Pruitt, standing 3 feet away with a pair of iron cuffs in his hand, and his badge pinned square, and his face the color of a man who has been carrying something for 18 years and has finally set it down. Marsh reached for the pistol at his hip, old habit, the reflex of a man who had always been the most dangerous person in any room he walked into. Don't, Gideon, Pruitt said. Marsh stopped. He looked at Pruitt, and Pruitt looked back at him, the way a man looks at another man when he's finally done pretending. Marsh took his hand off the pistol. Pruitt stepped forward. He put the cuffs on Gideon Marsh in front of 20 witnesses, in Cold Water Saloon, on the same floor where Naomi Hartwell had lain on her back 9 days ago, with a coin spinning next to her fingers. His hands did not shake, not once. Hartwell Ridge, 958. The 8 men from Dodge City were on the ground, wrists bound, loaded onto the wagon that Ethan had backed up to the gate 40 minutes ago, in the dark, without being asked because Ethan Cole had been paying attention. And somewhere to the south, by the sound of it, Amos Webb's people had done the same thing to the 6 men who'd set the barn fire. 14 rifles on the ground, 14 men in irons, Gideon Marsh's army, gone. Just like that, Naomi stood in the middle of her yard and looked at the red glow fading to the south. Webb's barn, still burning. It would be ash by morning. Amos would lose a week rebuilding it. He'd told her, when she'd ridden out to explain the plan, that a barn was a barn. He'd said, "Your daddy buried my wife. when the doctor in this town wouldn't come out to a dying woman at 3 in the morning because it was raining. A barn is a barn, Miss Hartwell. Ride home. She'd ridden home. Now she stood in her yard and watched the glow and breathed. Ethan was talking to someone on the wagon. His voice was low and steady, and she didn't catch the words. But she heard the tone. The particular tone of a young man who has just been through something that changed the size of him and is starting to understand that he fits the new size. The buckskin came through the back gate. Silas. Alone. Which meant she turned. Riker, she said. On the wagon, he said. Knees intact. Alive. He swung down. He'll have things to say in Wichita. He'll have things to say about everything Marsh has ever done in 20 years, she said. And a federal judge who will write it all down. Silas looked at her. You doing all right? I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me tomorrow. I'll do that. They stood there for a moment, the yard quiet around them. The fire dying to the south, the moon high now, white and clear, and the summer night warm and enormous. And for the first time in 9 days, not closing in, Naomi. He said. It was the first time he'd said her name without the miss. She noticed. She decided not to point it out. Thank you, she said, for coming down from the mountain. He was quiet for a moment. Thank Jonas, he said. He's the one I owed. No, she said. He's the reason you came to Redstone. What you did here. She looked at him. That's yours. He didn't answer. But he didn't look away, either. Morning, July 23rd, 1886. Naomi rode into Redstone at the head of a column that nobody in that town was ever going to forget. She rode her father's bay mare, his Winchester across the saddle. Her mother's turquoise brooch pinned at her throat, which June Aldridge had pressed into her hand at the gate first light, with both hands and steady eyes, and the single sentence. Your mother wore this to church every Sunday for 20 years. It belongs at the front of this column. Naomi had pinned it on without a word. It was the first time she'd worn it since Eleanor died. Silas rode on her right. Ethan, on her left, behind them, the Webb brothers, Clara Fenn and Hattie Graves, who had ridden through the night and looked like they'd enjoyed it. 4 men from the neighboring spreads. June Aldridge on her gray mule, leather satchel across her shoulder, chin up, and behind all of them, a wagon. Canvas over the top. A federal deputy on the buckboard with a shotgun. 14 men under that canvas. They rode down Main Street at 8 in the morning. The whole town was already awake. Nobody had slept. The news had moved through Redstone, the way news moves through a small town, which is to say instantaneously and slightly wrong, but close enough to make every person who heard it stop what they were doing and stand still. Every storefront had a face in it. Every porch had a person on it. The blacksmith came to his doorway with his leather apron still on. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The postmaster set down a mail sack on the boardwalk in front of his office and did not pick it up again. 2 boys on the roof of the feed store, who had apparently climbed up there for a better view, took their caps off simultaneously. The way you take your cap off for something serious. The way your mother taught you before you were old enough to understand why. Naomi did not look left. Did not look right. She rode straight through. She stopped in front of Coldwater Saloon. Holt Holloway was standing in the doorway. He was not polishing a glass this morning. He was holding a rolled apron in both hands, and his face had the look of a man. His had the look of a man who had spent the night deciding whether to run, and had not quite run, and was starting to understand that not running may have been the right call, but was going to cost him something significant regardless. Miss Hartwell, he said. She did not dismount. Holt, she said. There is a woman at the back of this column named June Aldridge. She has a leather satchel. In that satchel is a folio of 41 pages. Page 14 of that folio is a note in your handwriting, dated April of 1879, in which you promised Gideon Marsh a percentage of this saloon in exchange for a debt he forgave. She looked at him steadily. You are going to have a very detailed conversation with a federal judge about that page. The only question on this street at this hour is whether you have that conversation standing up or in irons." Holloway swallowed. "So," she said, "stand aside." He stood aside. She swung down, handed the reins to Ethan without looking, walked into Coldwater Saloon at 8:07 on the morning of July 23rd, 1886. The saloon smelled like last night's whiskey and lamp oil, and 20 men who had not gone home. Most of them were still there, standing at the walls, sitting at tables, some of them with their hats in their hands and some of them without hats at all, which meant they'd come in a hurry when the word went out to Shoal. Beckford stood against the far wall. Pruitt sat on a chair near the door, his hat on his knee, his badge square, and Gideon Marsh sat at the front table, cuffed, his hands on the felt in front of him, his whiskey glass empty at his elbow, his cards in a neat pile where someone, probably Beckford, had set them after he was arrested. He looked up when she came in. She walked to his table, stopped, looked at him. She had been thinking, in the back of her mind, through all of it. Through the fence and the dead cattle and the ledger and June's satchel and Pruitt on the porch and the back trail in the dark. She had been thinking that when she got here, to this moment, she would not know what to say. She had been wrong. She knew exactly what to say. She'd known, since she was lying on this floor 9 days ago, with a coin spinning next to her fingers. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "He said nothing. On the 14th of July of this year, one of your men put his boot on my shoulder on the floor of this saloon." This room laughed. She let that sit a moment. "On the 15th, your men cut my south fence and walked my dry well. On the 17th, you hired 8 men out of Dodge City to come up my back trail and burn my house with me in it. On the 22nd, you sat at this table and played a hand of cards while 14 men rode to kill me in my bed." She looked at him. "And in the spring of 1868, Mr. Marsh, you ordered a man to put a whip across my mother's horse on the Bent Fork Road. My mother died alone in a ditch 3 hours later with a broken neck. You signed a water rights deed over her body before she was in the ground." The room was completely silent, not just quiet. Silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the lamp burning. Marsh looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has spent the night in a room with no levers, and has not yet accepted that the room has no levers. He opened his mouth. She kept going. "I am not here to argue with you, Mr. Marsh. I am not here to debate. I am not here to ask you to explain yourself or apologize or say anything at all." She looked at him steadily. "I am here so that every man in this room hears me say those things while you are still wearing your own coat. Because in 6 months, you are going to be wearing a different one. And I wanted the last time I ever saw your face to be in the coat you bought, with my mother's water rights." The room did not breathe. Marsh's jaw worked. He looked down at the table. Naomi turned her back on Gideon Marsh, and she did not let his face again, not once, not for the rest of her life. She walked out of Coldwater Saloon into the morning light. The whole town was still there, watching. The street so quiet she could hear the mare's breathing at the hitching post. Silas was at the foot of the steps. He'd been waiting there. She hadn't asked him to wait there, but there he was. She stopped at the top step. He looked up at her, and June Aldridge appeared at her elbow and pressed something into her hand. Cold, small, silver-set, turquoise. "You dropped this when you dismounted," June said, which was a lie so obvious and so kind that Naomi did not call her on it. She looked down at her mother's brooch. Eleanor Hartwell had pinned this to her dress every Sunday morning for 20 years, had taken it off every Sunday evening, and set it in the cedar box on the dresser and put it back on the next Sunday without fail. Had worn it the day she told Gideon Marsh no. Had been wearing it, probably. On the Bent Fork Road, Naomi pinned it back at her throat. Looked up. "Thank you, June," she said. "Don't thank me," June said. "I've been waiting 11 years for this particular morning." Naomi looked out at the street, at the faces in the windows, at the boys still standing on the feed store roof with their caps in their hands. She She looked at Silas. "Let's go home," she said. The trial took 3 months. Held in Wichita, in a federal courthouse with tall windows and a judge named Reuben Calloway, who had seen everything in his 40 years on the bench, and who, when June Aldridge's 41-page folio was entered into evidence as Exhibit 41, took it home in his briefcase and read it overnight, and came back into court. The next morning, with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and his hands not quite steady, and summoned 11 people before 9 o'clock. Naomi testified on the 4th day. She was asked if she was certain of her memory. She opened the ledger on her lap, Your Honor. She said, "I am not speaking from memory. I am reading from a page I wrote on the night the thing happened, in my father's kitchen, in my father's shirt. I have the shirt, if the court requires it. The court did not require the shirt." June testified on the 11th day. Her folio was the kind of document that made the bailiff sit up straighter when he carried it across the room. Dora Cole testified on the 15th day. She came into that courtroom in a gray dress her cousin Ethan had bought with his own wages, and she sat in the witness chair, and she did not look at Marsh once. And she answered every question for 3 hours in a voice that never wavered. When the defense attorney tried to shake her on the date of a conversation she'd overheard in 1879, she said, "Sir, I poured that man's coffee every morning for 10 years. I know what he said. I know what he drank. I know which hand he held the cup in. You can ask me anything you like. I have been waiting 10 years to answer." The attorney stopped asking questions. Pruitt testified on the 18th day. He told the court about the coroner's paper in 1868, about the envelope under the loose board, about 22 years of choosing wrong. He said he was prepared to surrender his badge at the conclusion of his testimony and to serve whatever sentence the court required. Judge Calloway looked at him for a long time. "Sheriff Pruitt," he said, "sit back down. This court will rule on your disposition in its own time. You have given these proceedings more honesty in one morning than most men provide in a lifetime." A pause. "Sit down, sir." Pruitt sat down. Tom Riker testified on the 21st day. He had, in the end, asked to meet for approximately 3 weeks after his arrest and talked for 4 hours. All of it. Every job, every name, every instruction he'd received from Marsh going back 12 years. Not because he was afraid. He'd told Beckford. Silas Boone walked away from that Kansas ditch on purpose. That's different from surviving. I've been thinking about that difference for 22 years, and I finally figured out what it means. Gideon Marsh was convicted on the 63rd day. 24 counts, including the 1868 murder of Eleanor Hartwell. The sentence was carried out on a gray morning in February in the yard of the federal courthouse in Wichita, and Naomi Hartwell did not go. She was asked. She said, "I said my last words to him in a saloon. I won't take them back by watching him die. He belongs to the court now." Harlow Pruitt kept his badge. Judge Calloway ruled that a man who had done what Pruitt had done in that courtroom was not a man who needed to be punished. He was a man who had already punished himself for 18 years and had finally done something useful with it. Pruitt served 4 more years as sheriff. In that time, he arrested his own second deputy for taking bribes from a cattle operation 2 counties over. He rode out to 3 separate properties in the valley and served civil papers on men he had previously protected. He took no more envelopes from anyone. He retired in the spring of 1891. When he died in 1907, the church in Redstone held a service so full that the back 3 rows had to stand in the doorway. The man who gave the eulogy was a grown Ethan Cole, who had ridden from the next town over to do it. Ethan said only one thing from the pulpit: Harlow Pruitt told the truth, when the truth was the most expensive thing a man in this valley could buy. He paused. God rest him. He earned it. Holt Holloway sold Coldwater Saloon in the fall. Sold it to June Aldridge. She paid him exactly what it was worth and not $1 more, which, given what was on page 14 of her folio, was an act of considerable generosity that she was perfectly aware of and said nothing about. June ran the saloon for 26 years. She hired widows. She hired freedmen. She paid wages on time and kept the books clean and had them audited by the church every quarter, which was not legally required, and which she did anyway because she wanted there to be a clear record of the difference between the way the place had been run before and the way it was run now. The private room where Gideon Marsh had sat 3 nights before the 14th and planned a murder became a lending library. 42 books. Above the door of that room, June hung one framed piece of paper. Page 14 of her folio, Holloway's handwriting. His promise to Marsh in exchange for a debt forgiven. Below the frame, she wrote in her own hand, "I remembered when June Aldridge died in 1909. The deed to Coldwater Saloon passed to the Women's Cooperative she'd founded in 1894. The cooperative ran it for another 30 years. Nobody in Redstone called it Coldwater anymore by the time June died. They called it Miss Bell's, which was the name of the first widow June had hired, a woman named Agnes Bell, who had come to June's door in the winter of 1887, with 2 children and nowhere to go. Agnes Bell's granddaughter eventually became a school teacher, but that is a different story. Ethan Cole became a newspaper editor. He founded the Redstone Bulletin in 1892 and ran it for 30 years. He signed every column the same way, Ethan Cole, raised on Hartwell Ridge. By Jonas and Eleanor and Naomi Hartwell, his daughter became a lawyer in Kansas City. He wrote about her on the front page. The week she passed the bar, Dora Cole walked out of Marsh's kitchen the morning after his arrest, with everything she owned in a flour sack. Ethan was waiting at the telegraph office. He hadn't known she'd come. He'd just gotten up early and gone there because it seemed like the right place to be. They rode to Bent Fork together. That was how that started. Hartwell Ridge was never sold. The railroad spur line came through the valley in the spring of 1888, exactly as Marsh had predicted it would, and it came through exactly as Naomi had known it would. And when 3 men in city suits came to sit at her kitchen table and discuss the right-of-way, she had June Aldridge beside her, and the ledger open on the table, and the deed survey in her father's hand, pinned to the wall, where they could see it from their chairs. They offered her a number. She wrote a different number in the ledger, turned it around. "Slid it across the table, gentlemen," she said. "That is the figure. You'll write the check. I'll write the ledger, and I will be dividing it into 11 parts, 1 for each family," whose name appears on pages 3 through 9 of a certain folio Colonel LaPena held in evidence in federal court in Wichita. She looked at them. Those families had things taken from them by the same man who tried to take this ranch. The railroad coming through is going to profit from land that was nearly stolen. It's going to profit honestly or not at all. She paused. Those are the terms. They wrote the check. She wrote the ledger. For the next 40 years, 11 households in the valley kept a framed copy of one ledger page on the wall in their best room. Always the same page. In Naomi's small, careful hand, at the bottom of every copy, the same sentence. Paid in full from what was stolen to the people who were owed. Silas Boone did not leave. He built a cabin on the rise above the south pasture with his own hands, and Ethan's considerable help, and a level that Amos Webb lent him in the spring of 1887. It took them 6 weeks. The cabin was small, well-built, faced the sunrise. From the porch of it, you could see the whole valley. He worked the ranch, rose before light, took the work nobody else thought to do and did it without being asked. Understood the land the way a man understands something he has spent a long time being away from, and now cannot believe he was away from so long. He did not draw his pistol in Redstone again, not once. Not for the rest of his life. They married in the spring of 1887, on a clear April morning at the Webb property, with Amos giving the bride away and Hattie Graves standing with the ring, and the old circuit preacher reading from a Bible that had been dropped in a creek at some point and dried funny, diffus, no flowers. Too early in the season, no long speeches. Neither of them was a speech-making person. When the preacher asked Naomi if she took Silas Boone to be her lawfully wedded husband, she said, "I do. I have been taking him since the night he said one word in a saloon and meant it with his whole life. And I will keep taking him until one of us is in the ground. And after that," she said, and her voice was completely steady, "I will take him in whatever country comes next." Silas looked at her. He had the face of a man who has been braced for a long time and has just been told he can stop. The preacher said a few more words, then Amos Webb, 72 years old, cleared his throat and said he thought that was about as good a ceremony as he'd ever witnessed, and someone ought to eat something before it got too late in the day. They ate something. They did not have children of their own. In the winter of 1891, Dora Cole died of a fever in Bent Fork. 3 days after the first symptoms, before anyone understood how serious it was. She was 29 years old. She left behind a daughter named Mary who was 4, and a boarding house that was fully paid for and well run. Ethan wrote to Naomi. Naomi wrote back the same day, "Bring Mary home." Mary Hartwell Boone grew up on the ridge. She took the double name without being asked, which pleased Naomi greatly, and which she wrote about in the ledger on the day Mary chose it, age 7, with a 7-year-old's absolute certainty about things that mattered. Mary grew up to become the first woman elected to the school board of Redstone County. She served 19 years. When she retired, the county named the new schoolhouse in her honor. She never forgot where she came from. Silas died in the fall of 1911, 65 years old, in his own bed, in the cabin on the south rise that he had built with his own hands and lived in for 24 years and would not have traded for any house in any town. Naomi was beside him. She had been beside him for 3 days by then, which she had arranged without ceremony and without discussion. She'd simply moved a chair next to the bed on the first night and sat in it, and that was that. He was awake near the end. He looked at her. He said, "Her Naomi." She took his hand, did not speak. He knew she was there. "I stood up in time," he said. His voice was very quiet, but steady, the way it had always been steady. From the back of his chest, the voice of a man who said things he meant and nothing else. She pressed his hand. "You did." She said he closed his eyes. He did not open them again. She sat with him until the morning, then she got up, went to the kitchen, made coffee, and, when the coffee was done, she sat at the table and opened the ledger, the same ledger she'd been keeping for 25 years, the one that had started as her father's ranch accounts and become something else entirely, and she wrote in her small, careful hand, October 14, 1911, Silas Boone, my husband, died this morning in his own bed, on his own land in a valley that knew him at his best and at his worst, and did not deserve either, till he came down from the mountain and made it deserve him. He stood up in time. He said so himself, and he was right. He set down the pen, looked at what she'd written. Then she went back to sit with him until the ground was ready. Naomi Hartwell Boone lived 18 more years. She ran the ridge until she couldn't, and then she ran it sitting down, and then she ran it by telling Ethan's eldest son exactly what needed doing every morning, which he did without complaint, because he'd grown up on her father's stories and knew better than to argue. She died in the spring of 1929, 69 years old, in the same house her father had built, in the same bed her mother had slept in before the spring of 1868 when she stopped coming home. She was buried on the rise above the south pasture beside Silas Boone, beside the cabin he'd built, beside the fence line he'd walked 1,000 times in 24 years of mornings, and beside a small gray headstone that she had paid for herself in 1886, the year after the trial, the year she finally had something to put on it. It said Eleanor Hartwell, wife, mother, murdered 1868, remembered 1886. The town told different versions of the story for a long time after. Some people talked about the marshal and the trial and the hanging. Some people talked about the scarred mountain man who came into Coldwater Saloon on a July evening and said 3 words and changed everything. Some people talked about the sheriff who finally told the truth, but the real story was the one in the ledger, page after page, year after year, in Naomi Hartwell's small, careful hand, in ink that did not fade. The day she was thrown on the floor, the night she wrote it down, the morning she got back up. It was the story of a woman who was put on the floor of a public house and was expected to stay there, who did not stay, who pressed her palms to the wood and pushed herself upright, and decided in that moment that the rest of her life was going to be longer. 1 minute, and it was. It was much, much longer. And it was the story of a man who came down from a mountain, carrying 15 years of the wrong he'd done, and looked at a woman on a saloon floor, and finally understood that you cannot drink the past out of your head, that you cannot outrun it into the mountains, that the only way out is through. You stand up the next time, even when the next time is 15 years late, even when you're 47 years old and your face is scarred and your coat is worn and you've been gone so long. You weren't sure the world still had a place for you in it. You stand up anyway, because someone needs you to, because that is what decent people do. She kept the ledger until the end. The last entry was dated spring of 1929. 3 words, in the same small, careful hand she had used since she was 26 years old. Sitting in her father's kitchen, in her father's shirt, he stood up. That was all. That was enough.